The sound of mocking laughter cut through the freezing rain as Evelyn Ward face-planted into the black mud. "Hey, everyone! Here's our princess!" Cadet Maverick Stone shouted, his voice dripping with contempt as he pointed at the girl with neon blue hair struggling to crawl out of the muck. "Bet you want to run home crying to mommy now, don't you?" 36 Navy SEAL trainees erupted in cruel laughter, their voices like knives slicing through the downpour. This was day one of Hell Week, the infamous trial at Coronado Naval Base where only the strongest survive. And among the towering mass of muscle and testosterone, Evelyn Ward, 23 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with her strange neon blue hair and cold green eyes, looked like a catastrophic mistake. "I told you she wouldn't make it past the first day," Marcus Flint, the tallest trainee in the class, added with malicious glee. "Hell Week isn't a place for you to play dress-up games." Evelyn stood up slowly, wiping mud from her face without saying a word. What they didn't know was that she was counting voices, counting positions, counting reflexes. Because in less than a week, she would prove to them who really didn't belong here. Commander Dalton Briggs stood at the edge of the muddy training ground, his weathered face carved from decades of military service. Rain dripped from the brim of his campaign hat as he surveyed the chaos before him. 37 trainees had started this morning. By Friday, if history held true, only 7 or 8 would remain. Hell Week wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about breaking the human spirit and rebuilding it stronger. Those who survived would earn the right to continue SEAL training. Those who didn't would ring the bell and walk away in shame. "Listen up, maggots," Briggs's voice thundered across the compound, silencing the laughter instantly. "I don't care if you're 6 feet 4 inches of pure muscle or 5 feet nothing of pure stupidity. Hell Week doesn't discriminate. It will chew you up and spit you out regardless of your gender, your background, or your daddy's connections." His steel gray eyes swept across the formation, lingering for a moment on Evelyn. 80% of you will fail. That's not a threat. That's a statistical fact. The ocean doesn't care about your feelings. Hypothermia doesn't care about your ego, and I sure as hell don't care about your excuses. The rain intensified, turning the sand beneath their feet into a treacherous slurry. Evelyn stood perfectly still in formation, her athletic frame barely visible among the giants surrounding her. Her deep V-neck military green t-shirt clung to her toned physique, and her worn brown combat boots seemed almost fragile compared to the massive feet of her male counterparts. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she held her shoulders and positioned her feet, that suggested more than met the eye. "First exercise," Briggs announced, pointing toward the churning Pacific Ocean. 4-mile swim in 52-degree water. No wetsuits, no mercy. Anyone who falls behind gets pulled out and sent home. The trainees began jogging toward the shoreline, their boots splashing through puddles and surf. Maverick Stone deliberately shouldered past Evelyn, sending her stumbling sideways. "Try not to drown before we hit the water, princess," he sneered. Marcus Flint joined in the harassment, running close enough to spray sand in her face. "Hey, Maverick, think we should throw her a life preserver? You know, just in case her makeup runs." The pack of trainees around them howled with laughter, feeding off each other's cruelty like a pack of hyenas. But Evelyn said nothing. She simply adjusted her pace and kept moving forward, her green eyes fixed on the horizon. What the others didn't notice was how she automatically checked the wind direction before entering the water, or how her breathing pattern shifted to a precise rhythm that spoke of extensive cold water training. These were small details, barely visible, but to a trained observer, they might have raised questions. Dr. Thorne Ashworth watched from the medical observation post, his trained eye scanning the group for signs of distress. As the chief medical officer for SEAL training operations, he had seen thousands of candidates push their bodies to the breaking point. Most showed obvious signs of stress, elevated heart rates, shallow breathing, visible tension, but the young woman with the blue hair displayed none of these indicators. Her pulse appeared steady, her breathing controlled, her movements economical. It was unusual, almost unnaturally calm for someone supposedly experiencing this level of physical challenge for the first time. The ocean hit them like a wall of ice. Trainees gasped and cursed as the frigid water shocked their systems. Several immediately began struggling, their strokes becoming erratic as hypothermia set in. But Evelyn sliced through the water with smooth, efficient movements, her technique flawless despite the brutal conditions. She stayed in the middle of the pack, neither leading nor falling behind, but her stroke mechanics were those of someone who had spent considerable time in hostile waters. 20 minutes into the swim, Jackson Rivers, a lean trainee from Tennessee, began falling behind. His lips were blue, his movements sluggish. Evelyn, without breaking her own rhythm, adjusted her position to provide a windbreak, using her body to shield him from the worst of the current. It was a subtle gesture, the kind of tactical thinking that took years to develop, but she did it so naturally that most observers missed it entirely. They emerged from the water 90 minutes later, hypothermic and exhausted. Evelyn was among the first 15 to complete the course, her time well within acceptable parameters. But while the other successful swimmers collapsed on the beach, gasping and shivering, she remained standing, water streaming from her hair, already scanning the next training area. If watching Evelyn get humiliated in front of 36 elite trainees makes your blood boil, hit that like button right now. This story of hidden strength will blow your mind. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens to these arrogant trainees in the next few minutes will be absolutely insane. Trust me, you don't want to miss how this plays out. The log carry exercise came next, and it was designed to break team cohesion. Each boat crew of 7 trainees had to carry a telephone pole weighing 300 pounds across 2 miles of soft sand. The logs were deliberately designed to be impossible to carry comfortably, forcing the teams to work together or fail miserably. Maverick Stone, who had naturally assumed leadership of Boat Crew 2, made his intentions clear. "Ward gets the back position," he announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "That way when she gives up, she won't drag the rest of us down." The back position was traditionally the hardest, bearing the most weight, and receiving the least support from teammates. "Maybe we should just make her our team mascot," suggested Derek Walsh, another member of the crew. "She can run alongside us and cheer." The group erupted in laughter, their voices carrying across the beach to the other boat crews. But Evelyn simply took her assigned position without protest. As they lifted the log, something interesting happened. Despite her smaller frame, she seemed to know exactly how to distribute the weight, how to time the lifting motion, how to maintain stability during the carry. Her technique was flawless, suggesting extensive experience with this exact type of exercise. 40 minutes into the 2-mile carry, when muscles were screaming and several trainees were beginning to falter, Evelyn remained steady. Her breathing was controlled, her pace consistent. In fact, she appeared to be bearing more than her share of the weight, compensating for teammates who were beginning to struggle. Commander Briggs jogged alongside the crews, observing their performance. He had been running these exercises for 15 years and could spot potential leaders within the first few hours. Leadership wasn't always about being the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes it was about quietly doing what needed to be done while others focused on grandstanding. The mess hall that evening was a battlefield of testosterone and hierarchy. The remaining 31 trainees, down 6 from the day's casualties, gathered around long metal tables to consume their rations. The atmosphere was charged with the kind of aggressive bonding that formed between men facing shared hardship. Evelyn sat alone at the end of one table, methodically eating her meal while the others engaged in increasingly loud storytelling and posturing. She had changed into dry fatigues, but her hair was still damp, the neon blue color seeming almost otherworldly under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Hey, Princess," called out Tony Mitchell from across the room. "How's the 5-star accommodations treating you? Not quite the spa experience you were expecting?" The room filled with laughter and crude comments about the differences between male and female expectations. Maverick Stone stood up, his impressive frame casting a shadow across Evelyn's table. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the mess hall. "I think someone made a phone call. I think Daddy pulled some strings to get his little girl into the program for publicity purposes." He leaned closer to Evelyn, his breath hot against her ear. "Well, guess what, Princess? No amount of political correctness is going to save you when the real challenges start." Marcus Flint joined the confrontation, setting his tray down hard enough to make the metal table ring. "Seriously? What are you even doing here? This isn't some college sociology experiment. Real people's lives depend on the guys who make it through with this program." His voice rose with genuine anger. "Every spot you're taking up is a spot that could go to someone who actually belongs here." The room had gone quiet now, all eyes focused on the confrontation. Several trainees had their phones out, recording what they assumed would be an emotional breakdown. They expected tears, angry retorts, or dramatic exits. What they got instead was silence. Evelyn continued eating, her movements calm and deliberate. She cut her food into precise portions, chewed thoughtfully, and occasionally took small sips of water. Her green eyes remained focused on her plate, but there was something in her stillness that was beginning to unnerve her tormentors. "I'm talking to you!" Maverick's voice cracked slightly, his frustration growing. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" He reached out and knocked over her water glass, sending liquid splashing across the table. "Answer me when I'm talking to you!" For the first time that day, Evelyn looked up. Her green eyes met Maverick's brown ones, and for a moment, something passed between them. It wasn't fear or anger or defiance. It was assessment. She was studying him the way a scientist might study a specimen, cataloging weaknesses and patterns with clinical detachment. "I heard you," she said simply, her voice quiet but clear. Then she turned back to her meal, using napkins to clean up the spilled water with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Dr. Ashworth, who had been observing from the medical station, made a note in his logbook. Subject demonstrates unusual stress response patterns. No elevation in cortisol indicators despite sustained psychological pressure. Recommend continued observation. The night watch rotation began at 2200 hours, and each trainee was assigned a 2-hour shift, monitoring the perimeter. It was partly a security exercise, and partly another test of mental endurance. Standing alone in the darkness, fighting off exhaustion and cold, many trainees would begin to crack under the isolation. Evelyn drew the 0200 to 0400 shift, traditionally considered the worst slot due to the body's natural circadian rhythms. As she took her position at the north gate, her posture automatically shifted into what any military observer would recognize as a proper security stance. Her feet were positioned for quick movement, her hands free but ready, her head on a constant but subtle swivel pattern that maximized field of vision. Petty Officer First Class Michael Sterling, the night watch supervisor, made his rounds every 30 minutes. Most trainees would be fighting sleep, swaying on their feet, or attempting to sit down when they thought no one was watching. But Ward maintained perfect military bearing throughout her entire shift, her alertness never seeming to waver. More interesting was her instinctive reaction to sounds. When a small animal moved through the brush 60 meters away, her head turned toward it immediately, her body tensing in a way that suggested combat-trained reflexes. When a vehicle approached the main gate, she automatically moved to a position that provided both concealment and a clear field of fire, despite not being armed. These were not the actions of a civilian experiencing military training for the first time. These were the ingrained habits of someone with extensive tactical experience. Day 2 began before dawn with surf torture, one of Hell Week's most infamous trials. The trainees were required to link arms and sit in the freezing surf while waves crashed over them for 6 hours. The exercise was designed to induce hypothermia, disorientation, and psychological breakdown through prolonged exposure to cold and repetitive stress. As the sun began to rise over the Pacific, 31 figures sat in the churning water, their arms locked together in a human chain. The waves hit them every 15 to 20 seconds, each impact like a sledgehammer of ice water. Within the first hour, several trainees were showing signs of serious distress. Evelyn was positioned between Jackson Rivers and a massive trainee named Brett Morrison. Both men outweighed her by at least 80 pounds, but as the hours passed, it became clear that she was actually providing stability for the group, rather than receiving it. Her core strength seemed inexhaustible, her grip never loosening even as others began to falter. At the 4-hour mark, Derek Walsh began showing signs of severe hypothermia. His speech was slurred, his movements uncoordinated. The medical team was preparing to pull him out when Evelyn, without breaking the chain formation, somehow managed to share her body heat with him, using a technique that involved adjusting their positioning and breathing patterns. It was subtle, but effective enough to stabilize his condition until the exercise ended. Commander Briggs watched this interaction with growing interest. He had seen thousands of trainees attempt to help struggling teammates, but Ward's technique suggested formal training in cold weather survival, the kind of training that was only available to special operations personnel. The afternoon brought weapons familiarization training, and this was where Evelyn's cover story would face its first serious test. Each trainee was required to field strip and reassemble an M4 carbine while blindfolded, a standard test of familiarity with military hardware. The weapons instructor, Gunner's Mate First Class Patterson, demonstrated the procedure once, then handed out the rifles. "You have 15 minutes to complete a full disassembly and reassembly," he announced. "Anyone who fails to complete the task or damages the weapon is eliminated from the program immediately." Most trainees struggled with the exercise, their movements hesitant and clumsy as they tried to remember the demonstration. The average completion time was 12 to 13 minutes, and several failed entirely. But when Evelyn's turn came, something extraordinary happened. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, each motion flowing seamlessly into the next. The upper receiver separated from the lower, the bolt carrier group slid out, the firing pin was removed and set aside. There was no hesitation, no fumbling, no wasted motion. She completed the full cycle in 4 minutes and 37 seconds, using only one hand while maintaining a conversation with the instructor about wind drift calculations. Weapons familiarization drills revealed military-grade equipment designed for extreme operational environments. Modern tactical systems incorporated advanced materials science with battlefield-tested durability standards. Professional-grade weapon maintenance tools featured precision-engineered components capable of functioning in temperatures ranging from -40 to +160 degrees Fahrenheit. These specialized instruments included titanium alloy field stripping tools, corrosion-resistant lubricants developed for saltwater environments, and modular cleaning systems designed for rapid deployment scenarios. Such equipment represented the pinnacle of military technology, providing operators with reliable maintenance capabilities even under the most challenging combat conditions. Gunner's mate Patterson stared at the stopwatch, then at Evelyn, then back at the stopwatch. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "YouTube videos," Evelyn replied without missing a beat, her voice completely neutral. But Patterson wasn't buying it. He had been training Marines and SEALs for 12 years, and he had never seen a civilian demonstrate that level of proficiency with military weapons. The muscle memory, the automatic safety checks, the way she instinctively oriented each component for optimal efficiency, these were the habits of someone who had performed this task hundreds of times under stress. Dr. Ashworth was taking more detailed notes now. Subject demonstrates advanced mechanical aptitude and probable prior weapons training. Physiological stress indicators remain anomalously low across all measured parameters. Background investigation may be warranted. The medical emergency came without warning during the obstacle course run. Trevor King, King, a trainee from Ohio, caught his foot on a rope obstacle and fell 18 feet onto concrete, landing awkwardly on his left shoulder. The sound of impact was sickening, and King's screams immediately drew attention from instructors and medics. But Evelyn reached him first. While others stood frozen or ran for help, she dropped to her knees beside the injured man and immediately began a rapid trauma assessment. Her hands moved with clinical precision, checking for spinal injuries, evaluating circulation, assessing the extent of the shoulder damage. When King began showing signs of shock, she elevated his legs and monitored his pulse while maintaining verbal contact to keep him conscious. "Possible clavicle fracture, definite shoulder dislocation," she reported to Dr. Ashworth as he arrived with the medical team. "Pulse is steady but elevated, pupils are reactive, no apparent spinal involvement." Her assessment was delivered in the crisp, technical language of an experienced field medic. Dr. Ashworth's eyebrows shot up. "Are you familiar with emergency medical procedures?" he asked while examining the patient. "I took some first aid classes," Evelyn replied, but her technique told a different story. She had improvised a field 4 using materials from her personal kit, maintaining fluid pressure while the medics prepared King for transport. The procedure was flawless, suggesting extensive training in trauma medicine. As the ambulance pulled away, Dr. Ashworth pulled Evelyn aside. "That was impressive work in there," he said carefully. "Very impressive. Where exactly did you take these first aid classes?" Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "Community college," she said. "Pre-nursing program." But even as she spoke, Ashworth noticed that her hands showed calluses consistent with extensive rope work and weapons handling. Her fingernails were cut short in the military style, and there was a faint tan line on her wrist where a watch with a metal band had been worn for extended periods. "Hold up. Did you catch those survival techniques Evelyn just used? Drop a comment below if you spotted the military clues. Share this with someone who has ever been underestimated. The revelation coming next will change everything these trainees thought they knew." The psychological warfare phase began that evening with a deceptively simple exercise. Each trainee was locked in a shipping container for 48 hours with nothing but a gallon of water and a single MRE. Inside the containers, speakers played a continuous loop of disorienting sounds: gunfire, explosions, screaming, random loud noises designed to prevent sleep and induce paranoia. Most trainees spent the first few hours pounding on the walls, shouting to be released, or attempting to find ways to disable the sound system. The exercise was designed to break down mental defenses and identify those who could maintain composure under extreme psychological pressure. When the containers were opened after 48 hours, the results were telling. Several trainees were found curled in fetal positions. 2 had attempted to harm themselves to escape the exercise, and 1 had suffered a complete psychological breakdown and been removed from the program. But when they opened Evelyn's container, they found something entirely different. She was sitting calmly in the center of the space, her back straight, her breathing steady. But more interesting was what she had done with her environment. Using the metal clasps from her clothing and scratching with her fingernails, she had carved a detailed tactical map into the floor of the container. The map showed the entire Coronado facility, including guard positions, weapon storage areas, communication nodes, and potential infiltration routes. The level of detail was extraordinary. She had marked prevailing wind patterns, tidal schedules, shift change times, and vehicle movement patterns. It was the kind of intelligence preparation that would take weeks for a trained operative to compile, yet she had created it from memory during a 48-hour isolation exercise. Commander Briggs stared at the map for several long minutes, his expression unreadable. "How did you know about the auxiliary communication bunker?" he asked, pointing to a structure that wasn't visible from any publicly accessible area. "Lucky guess," Evelyn replied, but Briggs wasn't satisfied. The bunker she had marked was classified, known only to senior staff and security personnel. There was no way a civilian trainee could have identified its location, let alone marked its exact dimensions and probable access points. As the remaining trainees were processed through medical evaluations and debriefings, Briggs made a secure phone call to his superiors. The conversation was brief and cryptic, but certain phrases stood out: anomalous behavior patterns, possible security implications, and recommend immediate background verification. The land navigation exercise was scheduled for day 4, and it represented a significant escalation in difficulty. Each trainee was given a map, compass, and GPS unit, then dropped alone at different points in the mountains east of San Diego. Their mission was to navigate to 6 specific checkpoints spread across 30 miles of rugged terrain, then reach the extraction point within 18 hours. It was a test of mental toughness as much as navigation skills. The terrain was deliberately challenging, with steep ridges, dense vegetation, and several areas where GPS signals were blocked by topography. Many trainees would become lost, panic, and activate their emergency beacons to request rescue. Evelyn was dropped at the most challenging starting point, a rocky outcrop 8 miles from the first checkpoint with no visible landmarks. She was given the same equipment as everyone else: a basic military compass, a topographic map, and a GPS unit that would only function in certain areas. What happened next would be analyzed by military instructors for years to come. Instead of immediately heading toward the first checkpoint like most trainees, Evelyn spent the first 30 minutes conducting a detailed terrain analysis. She climbed to several vantage points, studying the landscape and comparing it to her map. She identified water sources, probable wildlife trails, and potential hazards. Most importantly, she plotted a route that would take her through all 6 checkpoints in optimal sequence, minimizing travel distance and elevation changes. Her navigation was flawless. She reached each checkpoint precisely on schedule, often arriving before the monitoring personnel had finished setting up their equipment. But more impressive was her route selection. Rather than following obvious trails or roads, she moved through terrain that provided natural concealment and multiple escape routes. It was the kind of tactical movement that special operations personnel learned through years of training and combat experience. At the 4th checkpoint, she encountered Jackson Rivers, who had become severely lost and was showing signs of dehydration and exhaustion. Without being asked, Evelyn shared her water and guided him to the correct route, then continued on her own mission. Her action potentially compromised her own completion time, but she seemed to prioritize teammate welfare over personal performance. The exercise monitors noted several unusual behaviors. Ward never used her GPS unit, relying entirely on map and compass navigation, even when satellite signals were available. Her movement patterns suggested advanced fieldcraft training, including the use of natural cover and terrain masking. Most tellingly, she automatically avoided areas that were known to be under aerial surveillance, despite having no official knowledge of monitoring protocols. Dr. Ashworth was becoming increasingly concerned about the anomalies he was observing. Ward's psychological profile showed none of the stress indicators typical of SEAL trainees. Her physical performance was consistent with someone who had years of conditioning rather than months. Most disturbing were the skills she displayed that weren't part of any civilian training program. That evening, he made his own secure phone call to the Defense Intelligence Agency, requesting a priority background investigation on trainee E. Ward. The response came back within 6 hours. No records found. Individual appears to have no documented history prior to 6 months ago. The impossibility of this result sent alarms through the intelligence community. In the modern surveillance state, it was virtually impossible for someone to exist without leaving digital traces. Social media accounts, financial records, educational transcripts, medical histories, employment records. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase Evelyn Ward's past. Day 5 brought the most feared exercise in all of SEAL training, drown-proofing. Trainees had their hands tied behind their backs and their feet bound together, then were thrown into a 12-foot deep pool. They had to bob for 20 minutes, float for 5 minutes, swim 100 meters, and then retrieve a dive mask from the bottom of the pool using only their teeth. The exercise had a 30% failure rate under normal circumstances. Many trainees would panic when they hit the water, thrashing wildly and exhausting themselves within minutes. Others would complete part of the exercise, but fail when their mental composure finally cracked. Evelyn approached the exercise with the same calm, methodical preparation she brought to everything else. As the instructors bound her hands and feet, she controlled her breathing and visualized the upcoming challenges. When they pushed her into the pool, she entered the water with perfect form, immediately establishing the rhythmic breathing pattern that would sustain her through the 20-minute bobbing phase. But what happened during the floating phase raised eyebrows among the monitoring staff. Instead of simply floating motionless as instructed, Evelyn demonstrated advanced water survival techniques that weren't part of the standard curriculum. She used micro-movements to maintain position, regulated her buoyancy with breath control, and showed none of the instinctive panic responses that plagued even experienced swimmers. During the 100-meter swim with bound limbs, she employed a modified dolphin kick that suggested extensive underwater training. Her efficiency was remarkable, covering the distance in a time that would have been impressive for an unrestrained swimmer. The dive mask retrieval, typically the most challenging part of the exercise, appeared almost effortless as she descended to the pool bottom with her hands and feet still bound. "How long can you hold your breath?" asked the pool instructor after Evelyn completed the exercise with the second best time in program history. "Never really timed it," she replied, but the instructor had been tracking her performance. During the dive phase, she had remained underwater for 4 minutes and 17 seconds while completing a complex task. That level of breath control typically took years to develop and suggested training in combat diving operations. The night infiltration exercise was supposed to be the final test before Hell Week's climactic phase. Each remaining trainee, they were down to 19 now, was required to penetrate a simulated enemy compound, retrieve a specific piece of intelligence, and escape without being detected by roving security patrols. The compound was actually a section of the Coronado base that had been converted into a training facility. It featured multiple guard towers, motion sensors, infrared cameras, and human sentries who took their jobs seriously. Most trainees would be caught during their infiltration attempts, providing valuable lessons about stealth and tactical planning. Evelyn's approach to the exercise was unlike anything the instructors had seen before. Instead of immediately attempting to penetrate the compound, she spent 3 hours conducting surveillance from multiple positions. She mapped guard patrol patterns, identified sensor locations, and noted the timing of shift changes. Her observation skills were extraordinary, catching details that even the exercise designers had missed. When she finally made her move, it was with the precision of a professional operative. She avoided the motion sensors by moving through their blind spots, used natural shadows to evade the cameras, and timed her movements to coincide with guard rotations. Her infiltration route took her through areas that weren't supposed to be accessible, suggesting knowledge of the facility's layout that went beyond what trainees should possess. The intelligence target was a manila folder, hidden in a locked file cabinet inside the compound's command post. Most trainees who reached this point would spend precious time trying to pick the lock or force the cabinet open. Evelyn opened it in under 30 seconds, using techniques that weren't taught in any standard military curriculum. But the most remarkable part of her performance was the exfiltration. Instead of retracing her infiltration route, she chose a path that took her through the most heavily guarded section of the compound. To the monitoring staff, it looked like a catastrophic error in judgment that would certainly result in capture. Instead, Evelyn used the guard concentration to her advantage. She moved between patrols with split-second timing, used the sentry's own positions to mask her movement, and created diversions that drew attention away from her actual location. It was a masterclass in tactical movement that demonstrated skills far beyond anything a civilian trainee should possess. She completed the exercise in 43 minutes, a new facility record. More importantly, the exercise monitors had to review camera footage to confirm her route, because several of them hadn't even realized she had been in their sectors. Commander Briggs was waiting when Evelyn emerged from the compound. His expression was unreadable, but his posture suggested a man who had reached some uncomfortable conclusions. "Interesting technique in there," he said carefully. "Where did you learn those movement patterns?" "Video games," Evelyn replied with a straight face. But Briggs had been in special operations for 22 years, and he knew the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. What he had just witnessed was the work of someone with extensive training in clandestine operations. That night, as the remaining trainees prepared for the final phase of Hell Week, a series of encrypted communications flowed between Coronado and various government agencies. The messages were brief and coded, but their urgency was unmistakable. Someone was very interested in learning more about trainee E. Ward, and they were willing to use considerable resources to do it. Financial protection services for military personnel and veterans represented a critical component of comprehensive security planning. Advanced insurance programs designed specifically for high-risk occupations included specialized coverage for combat-related injuries, psychological trauma support, and comprehensive family protection benefits. These policies featured enhanced death benefits reaching into millions of dollars, disability income protection designed for unique military career paths, and accelerated claim processing for emergency situations. Professional insurance consultants specializing in military needs could provide customized coverage analysis, including protection against career-ending injuries, specialized legal liability coverage for overseas deployments, and long-term care planning that accounted for service-related health complications that might manifest decades after active duty concluded. The final 24 hours of Hell Week traditionally consisted of a series of team-based exercises designed to test leadership under extreme stress. The remaining trainees were divided into 3 squads and given a complex mission scenario involving hostage rescue, explosive ordnance disposal, and tactical infiltration. Evelyn found herself assigned to Squad 2, along with Jackson Rivers, Marcus Flint, and 4 other trainees. The group dynamics were complicated by 5 days of accumulated stress, personality conflicts, and the knowledge that only the strongest performers would advance to the next phase of SEAL training. The mission scenario was deliberately chaotic. Intelligence was incomplete, equipment was limited, and time constraints made careful planning impossible. These were the conditions that separated natural leaders from those who simply followed orders, and the instructors watched carefully to identify emerging command potential. What they observed was a gradual shift in squad dynamics that nobody had anticipated. Initially, Marcus Flint attempted to assume leadership based on his size and aggressive personality. His plan was straightforward: overwhelm the enemy position with superior firepower and extract the hostages through brute force. It was a typically masculine approach that appealed to several squad members who were looking for simple, decisive action. But as the exercise progressed, it became clear that Flint's strategy wasn't working. The simulated enemy was too well prepared, the hostage location was too heavily defended, and the explosive devices were too sophisticated for a direct assault approach. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the squad began looking to Evelyn for guidance. It started with small things. When they encountered an unexpected obstacle, the others would glance in her direction. When equipment malfunctioned, they would wait for her assessment before attempting repairs. When tactical decisions needed to be made, they found themselves deferring to her judgment, despite having no official reason to do so. Evelyn never explicitly took command. She simply began offering suggestions, pointing out tactical considerations, and coordinating actions with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her leadership style was completely different from the aggressive posturing displayed by most military personalities. She led through competence rather than charisma, through results rather than rhetoric. The hostage rescue phase required precision timing and flawless coordination. The scenario involved 6 simulated hostages held in a 2-story building defended by 12 enemy operatives. Standard assault doctrine called for overwhelming force, applied simultaneously from multiple directions, but the building's layout made this approach impractical. Evelyn studied the problem for several minutes, then outlined a plan that was both elegant and audacious. Instead of attacking the building directly, she proposed using the enemy's own defensive preparations against them. Her plan involved creating multiple diversions, exploiting weaknesses in the defensive perimeter, and using unconventional infiltration routes that weren't covered by enemy fire. The plan worked flawlessly. Squad 2 completed the hostage rescue in 18 minutes with 0 simulated casualties, a performance that impressed even the veteran instructors monitoring the exercise. But more impressive than the results was the way Evelyn had orchestrated the operation. She had positioned each squad member to maximize their individual strengths, coordinated their actions with split-second timing, and adapted the plan in real time as circumstances changed. The explosive ordnance disposal phase presented a different type of challenge. The squad was confronted with a series of improvised explosive devices that had to be disarmed under extreme time pressure. The devices were realistic training aids that would simulate detonation if handled incorrectly, adding psychological pressure to an already stressful situation. Most SEAL trainees approached EOD training with understandable caution. Explosives were inherently dangerous, and even simulated devices could cause serious injuries if mishandled. The standard approach was to follow established protocols exactly, double-checking each step and requesting guidance when in doubt. Evelyn's approach was different. She examined each device with the clinical detachment of an experienced technician, identifying components and connections with impressive speed and accuracy. Her tool handling was precise, her sequence methodical, and her confidence absolute. She disarmed 4 separate devices in the time it took most trainees to analyze one. "Have you worked with explosives before?" asked the EOD instructor, a grizzled warrant officer with 28 years of experience. "Some demolition work during college," Evelyn replied, but her technique told a different story. She had used specialized disarming procedures that weren't taught in civilian settings, had identified component types that weren't commonly available, and had worked with the confidence of someone who had disarmed real devices under actual combat conditions. The final phase of Hell Week was always the most challenging because it combined physical exhaustion with complex decision-making under pressure. The remaining trainees had been awake for nearly 72 hours, had pushed their bodies beyond normal endurance limits, and were operating in a state of controlled desperation that revealed character in ways that normal circumstances never could. The exercise scenario was a simulated real-world crisis. Intelligence indicated that terrorist operatives had seized control of an offshore oil platform and were threatening to detonate explosive charges that would cause massive environmental damage. The SEAL teams had to infiltrate the platform, neutralize the terrorists, and prevent the detonation, all while working with incomplete information and limited resources. As Squad 2 prepared for the final assault, something unprecedented happened. Jackson Rivers, who had been struggling throughout Hell Week, collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. His core body temperature was dangerously low, his blood pressure was erratic, and Dr. Ashworth was preparing to remove him from the exercise when Evelyn intervened. She performed a rapid medical assessment, then implemented field treatment procedures that stabilized Rivers' condition enough for him to continue. Her technique was flawless, her confidence absolute, and her knowledge of combat medicine far beyond anything a civilian should possess. "Where did you learn trauma treatment?" Dr. Ashworth demanded as he watched her work. "Wilderness First Aid course," Evelyn replied, but she was performing procedures that required extensive medical training. She had established a Field 4, administered medications from her personal kit, and monitored vital signs with equipment that wasn't part of standard trainee gear. The storm hit without warning as they approached the final assault phase. What had been a training exercise in controlled conditions suddenly became a real survival situation as 50-mile-per-hour winds and driving rain turned the simulated oil platform into a genuinely dangerous environment. Several trainees were injured by flying debris, communications were lost, and the exercise controllers were preparing to abort the mission when Evelyn took charge. She didn't ask for permission or wait for orders. She simply began issuing commands with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. Her voice cut through the wind and chaos, coordinating rescue efforts and organizing the remaining trainees into an effective response team. Rivers, establish a casualty collection point in the lee of the main structure. Flint, secure all loose equipment and prepare emergency signals. Morrison, help me get the injured to safety. Her orders were crisp, specific, and delivered with absolute confidence. For the next 3 hours, as the storm raged around them, Evelyn coordinated a complex rescue operation that saved several lives and prevented what could have been a training catastrophe. She directed medical treatment, organized evacuation procedures, and maintained communications with rescue personnel using techniques that suggested extensive experience with crisis management. When the storm finally passed and regular communications were restored, Commander Briggs found himself in the unusual position of having to explain how a trainee had taken command of a training exercise and probably prevented multiple fatalities in the process. Wait until you see what the FBI discovers about Evelyn's real identity. If you're loving this twist, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Share this story because the truth about who she really is will absolutely shock you. The investigation began at 0600 hours on Saturday morning as Hell Week officially concluded. FBI agents arrived at Coronado Naval Base in unmarked vehicles, their credentials bearing the seals of agencies that most people had never heard of. They weren't there to congratulate the survivors or award certificates of completion. They were there to find answers about Trainee E. Ward. The first anomaly had been her performance metrics. The computers that tracked trainee progress throughout Hell Week had recorded data that didn't make sense. Her heart rate had never exceeded training levels, her stress hormones remained within normal ranges, and her sleep patterns suggested someone who was accustomed to operating on minimal rest. The physiological profile was completely inconsistent with someone experiencing extreme physical and psychological stress for the first time. The second anomaly was her skill set. The combat instructors had compiled a list of capabilities that Ward had demonstrated during training. Advanced marksmanship, combat medicine, explosive ordnance disposal, tactical movement, crisis leadership, cold weather survival, underwater operations, intelligence analysis. The list read like the resume of a career special operations officer rather than a civilian trainee. The third anomaly was her background, or rather, the complete absence of one. Agent Sarah Blake of the Defense Intelligence Agency had been conducting background investigations for 12 years, and she had never encountered anything like Evelyn Ward's file. The woman appeared to have materialized out of thin air 6 months earlier. No birth records, no school transcripts, no medical history, no financial records, no digital footprint of any kind. In the modern surveillance state, such anonymity was virtually impossible to achieve without significant resources and expertise. This doesn't happen by accident, Blake explained to Commander Briggs as they reviewed the preliminary investigation results. Someone with considerable technical capabilities has gone to extraordinary lengths to erase this woman's past. The question is why? Professional legal consultation services for national security personnel provided essential protection for individuals operating in classified environments. Specialized legal teams experienced in security clearance issues, intelligence operations oversight, and constitutional protections for government employees offered comprehensive support for complex legal challenges. These services included representation for security clearance appeals, protection against wrongful prosecution related to classified activities, and advocacy for whistleblower protections under federal statutes. Expert legal counsel, familiar with national security law, could provide guidance on disclosure obligations, liability protection for authorized operations, and defense against administrative actions that might compromise operational security or personal safety. As the FBI investigation intensified, Evelyn completed her final Hell Week evaluations with the same quiet competence she had displayed throughout the training. She answered questions honestly but minimally, provided required documentation without elaboration, and maintained the same mysterious composure that had characterized her entire performance. Dr. Ashworth conducted her final medical examination personally, hoping to gather additional information about her background. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. Her body showed evidence of extensive prior trauma, old bullet wounds that had healed cleanly, knife scars that suggested close combat experience, and bone fractures that had been set by military medical personnel. Her muscle development was consistent with years of specialized physical training, and her cardiovascular system showed adaptations typical of high-altitude operations. Most tellingly, she bore several small scars that Dr. Ashworth recognized as surgical implant sites. Someone had installed and then removed electronic devices from her body, probably communications or tracking equipment used by intelligence operatives. These scars are from military-grade surgical procedures, Dr. Ashworth noted in his report. The patient has clearly undergone extensive medical treatment for combat-related injuries. Her physical condition is consistent with someone who has seen significant action in hostile environments. But when he asked Evelyn about her medical history, she claimed to have no recollection of any serious injuries or surgical procedures. Either she was lying with extraordinary skill, or someone had done something to her memory. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Jackson Rivers, who had developed a protective attitude toward Evelyn during Hell Week, approached Commander Briggs with information he had been reluctant to share. During one of their conversations, Evelyn had let slip details about military operations that weren't part of any public record. She had mentioned specific unit designations, operational codes, and geographic references that suggested intimate knowledge of classified activities. She knew things she shouldn't know, Rivers explained. Details about operations in places that don't officially exist, involving units that don't officially exist. Either she's the most well-informed civilian in history, or she's not a civilian at all. As investigators compiled their findings, a picture began to emerge of someone who had been carefully prepared for deep cover infiltration. The erased background, the advanced skill set, the mysterious medical history, and the apparent memory gaps all pointed to the same conclusion. Evelyn Ward was an operative, but for whom? The breakthrough came when Agent Blake ran Evelyn's biometric data through classified databases that weren't normally accessed during routine investigations. The facial recognition algorithm found a match in files that were sealed at the highest levels of national security classification. The file was labeled Spectre Archive, Compartmentalized Access Required. Blake's security clearance wasn't sufficient to access the full file, but she could see enough to know that Evelyn Ward wasn't who she claimed to be. The woman had at least 3 documented identities, had participated in operations across 4 continents, and was associated with a program that officially didn't exist. Within hours, the investigation was taken over by personnel with clearances that Blake didn't even know existed. The FBI agents were politely but firmly removed from the case, and new investigators arrived with credentials that couldn't be verified through normal channels. Commander Briggs found himself in a secure conference room with people who wouldn't identify their agencies or explain their authority. They asked detailed questions about Evelyn's performance, her interactions with other trainees, and any anomalous behavior she had displayed. "Is she a threat to national security?" Briggs asked bluntly. "Unknown," replied a woman with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. "But she's definitely not what she appears to be, and her presence at this facility raises questions that need answers." As Hell Week officially concluded, 17 trainees had survived the complete program. They stood in formation on the beach where it had all begun, exhausted but proud, ready to continue their journey toward earning the SEAL Trident. Among them, Evelyn Ward stood quietly in the back row, her neon blue hair now faded from salt water and sun, her green eyes as mysterious as ever. The graduation ceremony was brief and formal. Commander Briggs congratulated the survivors, outlined the next phase of their training, and dismissed them to begin a well-earned rest period. But as the formation dispersed, he caught Evelyn's arm. "Ward, I need to speak with you privately." They walked in silence to his office, the same room where he had reviewed her initial application 6 days earlier. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then, and in many ways, it had. The woman sitting across from his desk was no longer the mysterious trainee who had arrived on Monday morning. She was something else entirely, and Briggs was beginning to understand just how carefully he had been maneuvered. "The FBI wants to talk to you," he said without preamble. "So, Does the DIA, the NSA, and several other agencies that I'm not allowed to name. Your background doesn't check out. Your skills are far beyond anything a civilian should possess, and your performance during Hell Week was unlike anything we've ever seen." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "Is that a problem, sir?" "That depends," Briggs replied. "Are you going to tell me who you really are, or do I have to wait for the investigation to run its course?" For a long moment, they stared at each other across the desk. Briggs had been in the military for 25 years, had worked with special operations personnel from every branch of service, and had developed an instinct for reading people under pressure. But Evelyn Ward remained an enigma, her expression revealing nothing. "I'm exactly who I appear to be," she said finally, "a candidate for SEAL training who wants to serve her country." "This is nonsense," Briggs said, but his tone was more frustrated than angry. "Your medical records are fake, your background is fabricated, and your skills suggest years of special operations experience. Either you're the most gifted natural athlete in military history, or you're running some kind of operation that I'm not cleared to know about." Evelyn stood up, her movement smooth and controlled despite 6 days of brutal physical training. "With respect, sir, I think you're overthinking this. Sometimes people are just better at things than you expect them to be." She moved toward the door, but Briggs wasn't finished. "The investigation isn't going away," he warned. "These people have resources and authority that you can't imagine. Whatever game you're playing, whatever operation you're running, they're going to figure it out." Evelyn paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure seemed to crack, and Briggs caught a glimpse of something beneath the surface. It wasn't fear or concern, but something deeper and more complex, something that looked almost like sadness. "Some games," she said quietly, "are more important than the people who play them." Then she was gone, leaving Briggs alone with more questions than answers and the uncomfortable feeling that he had just been outmaneuvered by an opponent he didn't even fully understand. The debriefing sessions with the other Hell Week survivors yielded additional pieces of the puzzle, but none that made the overall picture any clearer. Jackson Rivers spoke about Evelyn's uncanny ability to anticipate problems and her instinctive knowledge of military procedures. Marcus Flint, still somewhat awed by her performance, described technical skills that he had only seen in veteran operators. Even Maverick Stone, who had spent the week trying to break her spirit, admitted that she had demonstrated capabilities that were far beyond normal trainee levels. But when investigators tried to follow up on specific incidents, they found that details were often missing or inconsistent. Security camera footage from key moments was corrupted or missing entirely. Equipment that should have recorded data had malfunctioned at critical times. Radio communications that should have been preserved had been accidentally erased. It was as if someone with intimate knowledge of military monitoring systems had been systematically covering their tracks throughout the entire week. Dr. Ashworth's medical files painted the picture of someone who had been through extensive trauma and recovery, but the timeline didn't match Evelyn's claimed history. The surgical scars were at least 2 years old. The bone fractures showed evidence of having been treated by military medical facilities, and tissue samples revealed exposure to chemicals that were only used in specific combat environments. "This woman has been in active combat operations," Dr. Ashworth concluded in his final report. "Her medical history is consistent with someone who has sustained multiple injuries in hostile fire, has undergone advanced medical treatment in field conditions, and has completed extensive rehabilitation from serious trauma. None of this is consistent with the civilian background she claims." As Saturday evening approached and the successful Hell Week candidates prepared for their Liberty weekend, Evelyn made her way to the beach where everything had started. The tide was coming in, washing away the footprints and equipment marks that had accumulated during 6 days of intensive training. She stood at the water's edge, still wearing her faded fatigues and worn combat boots, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. To any casual observer, she looked like exactly what she claimed to be, a tired trainee reflecting on a challenging week of military training. But as the last light faded from the sky, she pulled out a device that definitely wasn't standard issue equipment. The communications gear was compact, encrypted, and designed for use by personnel who needed to maintain contact across vast distances without detection. She activated the device and waited. Within seconds, a voice responded with a brief coded challenge. Evelyn provided the correct response, and the channel opened for secure communication. "Spectre 7, reporting," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the waves. "Copy, Spectre 7. Status report. Mission Phase 1 complete. Cover identity maintained. Target facility has been fully assessed. Understood. Any complications? Evelyn glanced back toward the base, where investigators were still working through the night to uncover her true identity. Some interest from security personnel, but nothing that compromises the operation. Very well. Prepare for Phase 2 activation. Authorization will be transmitted within 72 hours. Copy that. Spectre 7 standing by. The transmission ended, and Evelyn shut down the device. She stood for several more minutes, watching the waves crash against the shore, thinking about the complexities of her situation. The investigation would continue, more questions would be asked, and eventually, some very determined people would start finding answers that would change everything. But for now, she was still Evelyn Ward, successful Hell Week graduate and candidate for SEAL training. The next phase of her mission would be even more challenging than the last, requiring her to maintain her cover while operating under increasing scrutiny from people who were trained to uncover exactly the kind of deception she was running. As she walked back toward the base, passing the memorial wall where the names of fallen SEALs were etched in granite, Evelyn reflected on the irony of her situation. She was risking everything to protect the very people who would see her as a threat if they discovered the truth. But some missions were more important than personal safety, and some secrets were worth any price to protect. The investigation would continue tomorrow. New questions would be asked, new evidence would be gathered, and new theories would be developed about who she really was and what she was really doing at Coronado Naval Base. But tonight, she was just another Hell Week survivor, tired and prude, and ready for whatever came next. The truth about Spectre 7 would remain hidden for a little while longer, protected by carefully constructed lies and the kind of operational security that had taken years to perfect. As she reached the barracks where the other survivors were already settling in for their first real night's sleep in a week, Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. Phase 1 had been completed successfully, despite several close calls and more attention than she had anticipated. Phase 2 would be even more dangerous, requiring her to maintain her deception while operating under the direct observation of people who specialized in catching exactly her type of infiltrator. But she had trained for this scenario, had prepared for every contingency she could imagine. The real test was just beginning. 3 days into the post-Hell Week recovery period, the investigation into Evelyn Ward had escalated beyond anything Commander Briggs had anticipated. What had started as routine background verification had mushroomed into a multi-agency operation involving personnel from the highest levels of national security. Black SUVs with government plates had become a permanent fixture in the Coronado parking lot, and men and women in expensive suits were asking questions that made seasoned military officers uncomfortable. Agent Blake found herself relegated to the periphery of an investigation she had initiated, watching as her case was absorbed by agencies whose very existence was classified. The woman she had been tasked to investigate had become the subject of a manhunt that involved resources typically reserved for international terrorists or foreign intelligence operatives. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Ashworth had been conducting additional analysis on tissue samples collected during Evelyn's medical examination, using equipment that wasn't normally available for routine screenings. The results were disturbing enough to warrant immediate attention from the highest levels of EF government. The chemical traces in her bloodstream tell a story, Dr. Ashworth explained to the assembled investigators in a secure conference room. She's been exposed to compounds that are only used in specific military applications, experimental performance enhancers, advanced medical treatments, and what appears to be neurological modification agents. Agent Blake leaned forward, her pen poised over her notepad. What kind of neurological modifications? Memory suppression, enhanced reaction times, pain tolerance amplification, Dr. Ashworth replied grimly. The kind of treatments that would be administered to deep cover operatives who needed to function under extreme conditions while maintaining plausible deniability about their true capabilities. Commander Briggs felt a chill run down his spine. He had served in special operations for over 2 decades, had worked with the most elite units in the American military, but what Dr. Ashworth was describing sounded like something from a science fiction novel. Are you saying someone turned her into some kind of enhanced soldier? I'm saying someone invested considerable time, money, and expertise in preparing her for a mission that required capabilities far beyond normal human parameters, Dr. Ashworth replied. The question is what that mission might be, and whether she's still carrying it out. Meanwhile, Evelyn was conducting her own investigation. During her off-duty hours, she had been systematically mapping the security protocols at Coronado Naval Base, identifying weaknesses and blind spots that could be exploited if circumstances required. Her movements appeared casual, the kind of exploratory wandering that any new trainee might engage in while familiarizing themselves with their environment. But her route selection was anything but random. She visited the communications center during shift changes, observed guard rotations at the weapons storage facility, and noted the timing of security patrols around sensitive areas. To anyone watching, she looked like a curious trainee exploring her new home. To a trained observer, her behavior pattern suggested operational reconnaissance. The confrontation that would change everything began innocuously enough. Maverick Stone had been struggling with the psychological aftermath of Hell Week, his confidence shattered by the revelation that someone he had dismissed as weak had consistently outperformed him in every meaningful metric. The knowledge that a woman with no apparent military background had made him look incompetent in front of his instructors and peers was eating away at his self-image. On Thursday afternoon, as the surviving trainees gathered for their first formal training session since Hell Week, Maverick's frustration finally boiled over. The session was taking place in the hand-to-hand combat training facility, a large gymnasium equipped with mats, training dummies, and observation platforms for instructors. "I want a rematch," Maverick announced loudly as the trainees were pairing off for sparring exercises. Ward got lucky during Hell Week, but now that we're all rested and recovered, let's see how she handles a real fight. The challenge was delivered with enough volume to draw attention from across the gymnasium. Conversations stopped, heads turned, and within seconds, every eye in the facility was focused on the developing confrontation. Evelyn was adjusting the straps on her training gear when Maverick's words reached her. She looked up calmly, meeting his gaze without expression. "I don't think that's necessary," she said quietly. "Of course you don't," Maverick replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "Because you know that without the chaos and confusion of Hell Week to hide behind, you're just another weak civilian playing soldier." Marcus Flint stepped forward, his massive frame adding physical weight to the verbal challenge. "Come on, Ward. You've been acting like you're better than all of us. Prove it in a fair fight, one-on-one, no distractions." The other trainees began forming a loose circle around the potential combatants, their excitement palpable. This was the kind of confrontation that had been building since the first day of Hell Week. The inevitable collision between traditional military hierarchy and the anomaly that Evelyn represented. Instructor Chief Petty Officer Bradley Kingston had been overseeing the training session from the observation platform, but the developing situation drew his attention immediately. Kingston had been running combat training for 8 years, had seen hundreds of disputes between trainees, and knew how to read the dynamics of masculine competition. But there was something different about this confrontation. Ward's body language wasn't defensive or aggressive. She stood perfectly still, balanced and ready, but not in the way of someone preparing for a fight. She looked more like someone calculating variables in a complex equation. "If you're so confident," Maverick continued, emboldened by the attention and the apparent support of his peers, "then prove it. No rules, no time limits, just you and me until one of us can't continue." The challenge hung in the air like smoke, charged with testosterone and wounded pride. The other trainees were clearly expecting Evelyn to either back down or accept the confrontation. What they weren't expecting was her response. "I don't fight for entertainment," she said simply. Maverick's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You don't fight because you can't fight. Everything you did during Hell Week was just luck and tricks. When it comes to real combat, you're nothing." He took a step closer, using his height and bulk to intimidate. "Unless you're afraid? Unless the little princess doesn't want to break a nail?" The crowd stirred restlessly, sensing that the verbal confrontation was approaching a tipping point. Several trainees pulled out their phones, anticipating the kind of dramatic moment that would generate viral social media content. But Evelyn remained motionless, her green eyes fixed on Maverick with the same clinical assessment she had displayed throughout Hell Week. She was studying him, cataloging his emotional state, his physical positioning, his probable responses to various stimuli. "Last chance," Maverick snarled, moving close enough that his breath touched her face. "Fight me, or admit that you don't belong here." Chief Kingston was preparing to intervene when Evelyn finally responded. But instead of accepting or declining the challenge, she did something completely unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, or a nervous smile, or a defiant smile. It was the kind of smile that predators displayed when they realized their prey had made a fatal mistake. The expression transformed her entire face, revealing something cold and dangerous that had been hidden beneath her carefully maintained facade. "You really want to do this?" she asked quietly. Maverick mistook her question for weakness, for a last-ditch attempt to avoid the inevitable confrontation. "Stop stalling and fight, or get out of my sight." What happened next would be analyzed frame by military training specialists for years to come. Maverick lunged forward, attempting to grab Evelyn's shoulders and use his weight advantage to force her to the ground. It was a straightforward attack, the kind of aggressive move that had worked for him countless times against smaller opponents. But Evelyn wasn't there when his hands arrived. She had moved at the last possible second, a minimal shift that redirected his momentum while maintaining perfect balance. As Maverick stumbled past her, thrown off balance by his own force, Evelyn's hand touched his wrist in what looked like a gentle tap. The effect was immediate and devastating. Maverick's entire left arm went numb, his fingers losing all feeling as nerve pressure points were precisely manipulated. He spun around, confusion and alarm replacing his earlier confidence, just in time for Evelyn's next move. She didn't strike him, or throw him, or apply any obvious combat technique. Instead, she simply stepped into his personal space, her movements flowing like water, and suddenly Maverick found himself off balance again, his body responding to subtle manipulations that he couldn't understand or counter. He swung wildly with his right hand, a haymaker that should have connected with devastating force. But Evelyn had already moved, the punch whistling past her ear while she positioned herself for what came next. The takedown was so quick and precise that most observers missed the actual mechanics. One moment, Maverick was standing, aggressive and confident. The next moment he was on the ground, his right arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold that made movement impossible. But it was what happened during the takedown that changed everything. As Evelyn executed the technique, Maverick's desperate grab for leverage caught the collar of her training shirt. The fabric, already stressed from 6 days of Hell Week abuse, tore from her left shoulder down to her sternum, exposing her chest and upper torso to the assembled crowd. And that's when everyone saw the tattoo. Etched across her shoulder blade in stark black ink was a cobra, coiled and ready to strike. But it wasn't just any cobra. This one was wrapped around text that made several observers gasp in recognition. Spectre 7. The tattoo was overlaid on old scar tissue, bullet wounds that had healed into raised, discolored patches that spoke of survival in circumstances that should have been fatal. The gymnasium fell silent except for the sound of Maverick's labored breathing as he struggled against the submission hold. Every phone in the room was now pointed at Evelyn, recording the revelation that would change everything about how people perceived her. Chief Kingston stared at the tattoo, his face going pale as recognition dawned. He had served with special operations personnel throughout his career, had heard whispered stories about units that operated beyond official acknowledgement. Spectre 7 wasn't just classified, it was legendary. The unit that had supposedly been wiped out during a mission that officially never happened. "Holy cow," someone whispered from the crowd. That's not possible." Dr. Ashworth, who had been observing the training session from the medical station, dropped his clipboard and reached for his secure phone. The implications of what he was seeing sent alarm bells through his consciousness. If Ward was indeed connected to Spectre 7, then every assumption about her background, her capabilities, and her reasons for being at Coronado needed to be reevaluated. But the most dramatic reaction came from an unexpected source. Colonel Hayes Whitman had arrived at the training facility for a routine inspection, part of his regular oversight duties as commanding officer of West Coast SEAL operations. He had been reviewing paperwork in the administrative office when the commotion in the gymnasium drew his attention. Now he stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the tattoo with an expression of disbelief, and something that might have been fear. Colonel Whitman had been involved in special operations planning for 28 years, had clearances that gave him access to information that most people couldn't imagine, and he knew exactly what the Spectre 7 designation meant. Without conscious thought, his body moved into a position of attention, his right hand rising to his forehead in a crisp military salute. The gesture was automatic, driven by ingrained respect for operators whose sacrifices had shaped the modern landscape of American special operations. "Agent X-47, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent gymnasium. "We thought you were dead." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Phones shook in nervous hands as people tried to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about a mysterious trainee with unusual skills. This was about someone with connections to the deepest levels of American intelligence operations. Evelyn released Maverick from the submission hold, allowing him to crawl away while she stood and faced Colonel Whitman. Her torn shirt hung loose, the tattoo fully visible to everyone present. For the first time since arriving at Coronado, her carefully maintained cover had been completely blown. "Reports of my death," she said calmly, "were greatly exaggerated." The aftermath was swift and overwhelming. Within minutes, the gymnasium was flooded with security personnel and federal agents who had been monitoring the situation from various surveillance posts around the base. The trainees were ordered to surrender their phones and were escorted to separate debriefing rooms, where they would spend the next several hours answering questions about everything they had observed during Hell Week and afterward. Evelyn found herself in a secure conference room with Colonel Whitman and a collection of individuals whose credentials were so highly classified that they couldn't be verified through normal channels. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the weight of revelations that had national security implications. "The Spectre program was officially terminated 4 years ago," said a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much classified information. "All operatives were declared KIA following the Yemen operation. Yet, here you are, very much alive, operating under deep cover at a military training facility." Evelyn sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing. The torn shirt had been replaced with a standard military sweatshirt, but everyone in the room had seen the tattoo and understood its implications. "I'm here to complete a mission," she said simply. "What mission?" Colonel Whitman demanded. "Who authorized it? What agency are you working for?" "That information is compartmentalized above your clearance level," Evelyn replied without emotion. "Even yours, Colonel." The room stirred uneasily. It was rare for anyone to claim security clearances higher than those held by the people in this room. The fact that Evelyn did so without hesitation suggested that she was either telling the truth or running a bluff of extraordinary proportions. Agent Blake, who had been observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. "The investigation into your background has revealed a systematic erasure of personal history that required significant resources and technical expertise. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to create your cover identity. Who was it?" "People who needed a problem solved," Evelyn answered. "What problem?" "The kind that requires unofficial solutions." The cryptic responses were clearly frustrating the investigators, but Evelyn's demeanor suggested that she had been trained to resist interrogation by experts far more skilled than anyone present. Her answers provided just enough information to avoid appearing completely uncooperative while revealing nothing of substance about her true mission. That tattoo reveal just changed everything. If this story gave you chills, like and subscribe for more incredible tales of hidden warriors. Check out our next video about the Navy SEAL who infiltrated a biker gang. Link in the description. The investigation that followed would reshape how the military approached security screening for elite training programs. Comprehensive background checks that had previously been considered adequate were revealed to be laughably insufficient when confronted with the resources of organizations that operated beyond normal governmental oversight. But the immediate priority was damage control. The trainees who had witnessed the confrontation were subjected to intensive debriefing sessions designed to assess how much they understood about what they had seen. Most had recognized that something significant had happened, but few grasped the full implications of the Spectre 7 revelation. Maverick Stone, who had initiated the confrontation that exposed Evelyn's identity, found himself facing the most intensive scrutiny. His motivations were examined, his background was reviewed, and his psychological profile was analyzed to determine whether his actions had been spontaneous or whether he might have been manipulated by outside forces. "I just wanted to prove she wasn't as tough as she pretended to be," Maverick explained for the 4th time in as many hours. "I had no idea about any of this classified stuff. I thought she was just some civilian who got lucky during Hell Week." His sincerity was evident, but the investigators weren't taking any chances. The possibility that foreign intelligence services might have been involved in exposing Evelyn's cover had to be considered and evaluated. Marcus Flint's reaction was different, but equally intense. The revelation that he had been antagonizing someone with Evelyn's background had shattered his confidence and left him questioning everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and personal capability. "She could have killed me at any time," he said during his debriefing session. "Any of us. We were treating her like she was weak, but she was probably the most dangerous person on the entire base. Jackson Rivers, who had developed a protective attitude toward Evelyn during Hell Week, felt vindicated, but also disturbed by the implications of what he had witnessed. I knew there was something different about her, but I never imagined anything like this. How many other people are there? How many other operations are going on that we don't know about? It was a question that the investigators couldn't answer, and that troubled them considerably. Educational consultation services for military personnel, transitioning to specialized career fields, provided comprehensive support for individuals pursuing advanced technical training and professional development opportunities. These programs included career assessment counseling, specialized certification preparation, and academic planning services designed specifically for service members seeking to leverage their military experience in civilian professional environments. Advanced consultation packages featured personalized career coaching, industry-specific training recommendations, and networking opportunities with professionals who had successfully transitioned from military to civilian leadership roles. Educational consultants specializing in military career transitions could provide guidance on optimal degree programs, professional certification pathways, and strategic career planning that maximize the value of military experience while opening doors to high-level civilian opportunities. The consequences of Evelyn's exposure rippled outward through multiple levels of the military and intelligence communities. What had started as a routine training incident had revealed the existence of operations that were supposed to be invisible, raising questions about oversight, accountability, and the true scope of America's shadow war capabilities. Commander Briggs found himself at the center of a storm that threatened to consume his career. His failure to identify Evelyn's true nature during the application process was being scrutinized by investigators who seemed to assume that either incompetence or corruption must have been involved. "How does someone with that background slip through our screening procedures?" demanded Admiral Richardson during a tense conference call with Pentagon officials. "Either our security protocols are fundamentally flawed, or someone deliberately circumvented them." "Her documentation was perfect," Briggs replied, struggling to maintain his professional composure. "Every background check came back clean. There were no red flags in any of the systems we normally use for verification. Because someone with access to those systems made sure there wouldn't be," Admiral Richardson shot back. "The question is who, and whether they're still in a position to compromise other operations." The investigation expanded beyond Evelyn herself to encompass everyone who had been involved in her application and acceptance process. Personnel files were reviewed, financial records were examined, and communication logs were analyzed for any sign that the normal screening procedures had been deliberately subverted. But even as the official investigation proceeded, other forces were moving behind the scenes. Dr. Ashworth received a visit for two individuals who claimed to represent a government medical research program. They were interested in the tissue samples and blood work he had collected from Evelyn, offering substantial compensation for his cooperation, and suggesting that his career prospects would be significantly enhanced by his willingness to share information. When he refused, citing patient confidentiality and medical ethics, their tone became less friendly. Subtle references were made to the fragility of military medical careers and the ease with which security clearances could be revoked for minor infractions. Dr. Ashworth found himself caught between competing pressures, uncertain about whom he could trust or what the right course of action might be. The woman he had examined was clearly not what she appeared to be, but the people investigating her seemed to have their own hidden agendas. Chief Kingston faced similar pressures. His first-hand observation of Evelyn's combat capabilities had made him a valuable witness, but also a potential security risk. He was offered incentives to provide detailed descriptions of her techniques, and subtle threats were made about the consequences of being uncooperative. Meanwhile, Evelyn herself had vanished. The morning after the gymnasium confrontation, her quarters were found empty, her personal belongings gone, and no trace of how she had departed the base. Security cameras showed nothing unusual, access logs revealed no unauthorized departures, and guard posts reported no suspicious activity. It was as if she had simply evaporated, leaving behind only questions and the growing realization that the people investigating her had been dealing with someone whose capabilities far exceeded their ability to contain or control. The search for her extended beyond Coronado Naval Base to encompass a network of intelligence and law enforcement agencies across multiple continents. But the hunt was hampered by the fact that nobody seemed to know exactly who they were looking for Or what resources might be available to help her disappear. Agent Blake found herself reassigned to other cases. Her involvement in the Evelyn Ward investigation apparently concluded, but the questions raised by the case continued to haunt her professional and personal thoughts. How many other deep cover operatives were operating within American military and intelligence organizations? What missions were they pursuing? And who was ultimately responsible for their activities? The trainees who had survived Hell Week alongside Evelyn were transferred to different training programs, their SEAL candidacies placed on indefinite hold while investigators determined whether they posed any security risks. Most would eventually return to their original military units. Their dreams of special operations careers effectively ended by their association with a classified incident they didn't understand. Jackson Rivers was the exception. His protection of Evelyn during Hell Week and his insights into her behavior had marked him as someone with potential value to the intelligence community. He was approached with offers of specialized training and career opportunities that would take him far from conventional military service. "She saw something in you," Agent Blake explained during their final debriefing session. "Someone with her background doesn't risk exposure to help a teammate unless she believes that person has exceptional potential." Rivers accepted the offer, understanding that his military career had been forever changed by his brief association with someone whose true identity he was only beginning to comprehend. 6 months later, the official investigation into the Evelyn Ward incident was quietly closed. The final report, classified at the highest levels of government, concluded that an unauthorized intelligence operation had been exposed due to operational security failures. Recommendations were made for enhanced screening procedures and improved interagency coordination, but the questions raised by the case continued to reverberate through the intelligence community. A new position was created within the Defense Intelligence Agency, officially tasked with investigating anomalous personnel issues within military training programs. Unofficially, it was understood that the position existed to watch for other operations like the one Evelyn had been conducting. Agent Blake was offered the job, her experience with the Ward case making her uniquely qualified to recognize the signs of deep cover infiltration. She accepted, understanding that her career had been fundamentally altered by her encounter with someone who operated beyond the normal boundaries of government service. The Coronado Naval Base implemented new security protocols designed to detect and prevent unauthorized access by individuals with advanced infiltration training. Background screening procedures were enhanced, surveillance systems were upgraded, and staff training was modified to include recognition of potential deep cover operatives. But even as these measures were put in place, senior officials understood that they were probably inadequate to detect future operations conducted by organizations with the resources and expertise that had been demonstrated in the Ward case. Commander Briggs completed his tour at Coronado and was reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, his career effectively stalled by his association with a security failure he still didn't fully understand. He spent his remaining years in service wondering how many other anomalies he had missed. How many other operations had proceeded undetected under his watch? Dr. Orr. Ashworth left military service entirely, accepting a position with a civilian hospital where he hoped to practice medicine without the complications of classified operations and intelligence investigations. But he continued to wonder about the woman he had examined, about the scars and chemical traces that told a story of experiences beyond normal human endurance. The trainees who had witnessed Evelyn's exposure were required to sign additional non-disclosure agreements, their security clearances permanently flagged, with notations that would follow them throughout their military careers. Most adapted to their new circumstances, but a few struggled with the knowledge that their understanding of military operations had been fundamentally incomplete. Maverick Stone never fully recovered from the psychological impact of learning that he had been antagonizing someone with Evelyn's capabilities. He completed his military service in conventional units, his confidence shattered by the realization that strength and aggression were inadequate when confronted with superior training and experience. But the most lasting impact was on the institutions themselves. The military training establishment had been forced to confront the possibility that their most basic assumptions about personnel screening and operational security were inadequate when dealing with organizations that operated beyond normal governmental oversight. The implications were disturbing enough to prompt fundamental changes in how security was approached across multiple agencies. As the first anniversary of the incident approached, Agent Blake received an encrypted message that had been routed through multiple anonymous servers. The text was brief. The mission continues. Thank you for your discretion. It was unsigned, but Blake understood that it had come from someone who had been watching the investigation and its aftermath with considerable interest. She filed the message in a secure folder and wondered whether she would encounter Evelyn Ward again, and under what circumstances. The message was followed by a series of reports about successful counterintelligence operations in various parts of the world. Terrorist cells disrupted, foreign intelligence networks compromised, weapons trafficking organizations destroyed. The operations were too sophisticated and well-coordinated to be coincidental, suggesting the involvement of resources and capabilities that exceeded those of conventional intelligence agencies. Blake began to understand that the Evelyn Ward incident had been just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, a glimpse into operations that were conducted by people who didn't officially exist in service of missions that were never officially acknowledged. The knowledge was both fascinating and terrifying, a reminder that the world of international security was far more complex and dangerous than most people imagined. Somewhere out there, Evelyn Ward and others like her were continuing to operate in the shadows, pursuing objectives that were deemed too sensitive for normal governmental oversight. 2 years after the incident, a package arrived at Blake's office with no return address or delivery documentation. Inside was a challenge coin bearing the Spectre 7 insignia, along with a brief note. For services rendered in the interest of national security. Blake understood that it was both a thank you and a warning. Her discretion during the investigation had been noted and appreciated, but it had also marked her as someone who could be trusted with information that most people would never be allowed to know. She placed the coin in her desk drawer and returned to her work, knowing that she was now part of a community that existed parallel to normal government service. A community of people who knew more than they could ever reveal about the true nature of American intelligence operations. The final piece of the puzzle came 3 years later, when Blake was contacted by a representative of an organization that didn't have an official name or acknowledged existence. The contact was made through intermediaries who verified her security clearances and professional background before arranging a meeting in a location that was electronically secure. Agent Ward has recommended you for a consulting position, the representative explained. Part-time work, exceptional compensation, complete deniability. Interested? Blake understood that she was being offered the opportunity to work directly with the organization that had been responsible for Evelyn's original mission. The chance to move beyond investigating such operations to actually participating in them. She accepted, knowing that her career in conventional government service was effectively over. But she also understood that she was being offered the chance to contribute to missions that were more important than anything she could accomplish through normal channels. The work was exactly what she had expected, challenging, dangerous, and conducted with resources that exceeded anything available to conventional agencies. She worked with people who had capabilities that bordered on superhuman, on missions that addressed threats that most Americans would never know existed, and occasionally she worked with Evelyn Ward. The woman who had been known as Agent X-47 continued to operate under various identities, pursuing objectives that were deemed too sensitive for normal governmental oversight. Her capabilities had been enhanced through additional training and medical procedures. Her cover identities were now virtually undetectable, and her mission parameters had been expanded to encompass threats that spanned multiple continents. But she was no longer operating alone. The exposure at Coronado had led to the recruitment of additional personnel who could provide support and backup for operations that had previously been conducted by single agents. Jackson Rivers had completed specialized training and was now working alongside her on missions that required multiple operators with complementary skills. The organization itself had evolved, adapting its methods and expanding its capabilities in response to changing global threats. What had started as a small group of elite operatives had grown into something approaching a parallel intelligence service, one that operated with complete autonomy and resources that were derived from sources that couldn't be traced through normal financial channels. Blake's role within this organization was to provide strategic analysis and operational planning, using her investigative skills to identify threats and develop response strategies. Her experience with the original Evelyn Ward case had given her unique insights into how such operations could be detected and countered, knowledge that was invaluable for protecting current operations from exposure. But even as she settled into her new role, Blake understood that she was still only seeing a small part of a much larger picture. The organization had tentacles that reached into every aspect of American society and beyond, pursuing objectives that were coordinated by people whose identities and motivations remained mysterious even to trusted insiders. The final revelation came 5 years after the original incident, when Blake was given access to files that explained the true scope of what she had encountered at Coronado Naval Base. The Evelyn Ward case hadn't been an isolated incident or an unauthorized operation. It had been a carefully orchestrated test, designed to evaluate the security protocols of elite military training programs and to identify potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile foreign intelligence services. Every aspect of the operation had been planned in advance, from Evelyn's insertion into the SEAL training program to the eventual exposure of her identity. The goal had been to determine whether existing security measures were adequate to detect and contain sophisticated infiltration attempts. The answer clearly was no. The lessons learned from the exercise had led to comprehensive reforms in how military and intelligence organizations approached personnel security. New screening procedures had been implemented, surveillance systems had been upgraded, and training programs had been modified to include recognition of potential deep cover operatives. But more importantly, the exercise had identified individuals like Jackson Rivers and Agent Blake herself, people with the potential to contribute to operations that required capabilities beyond those available through conventional channels. The organization had been conducting similar tests across multiple agencies and institutions, gradually building a network of personnel who could be trusted with missions that were too sensitive for normal governmental oversight. The ultimate goal was to create a parallel intelligence capability that could address threats that were beyond the reach of conventional agencies. Blake understood that she had been recruited not despite her investigation of Evelyn Ward, but because of it. Her ability to recognize and analyze sophisticated deception made her valuable for operations that required the highest levels of operational security. As she reviewed the classified files that detailed the true scope of the organization's activities, Blake realized that the world was far more dangerous and complex than most people imagined. Threats existed that were beyond the capability of conventional military and intelligence services to address, requiring the kind of resources and autonomy that could only be provided by organizations that operated outside normal governmental oversight. The work was dangerous, morally ambiguous, and conducted with almost no accountability to traditional democratic institutions. But it was also necessary, addressing threats that could not be countered through conventional means. And somewhere in the world, Evelyn Ward continued her work, pursuing missions that were deemed too important to be constrained by normal governmental procedures. Her exposure at Coronado had been a temporary setback, but it had also led to the expansion and improvement of capabilities that were essential for addressing the most serious threats to national security. The phone call that would define the next phase of operations came on a Thursday evening, encrypted and routed through multiple servers to prevent tracing. Blake answered on the second ring, already knowing that the call would involve something significant. "We have a situation." Evelyn's voice was calm but urgent. "Multiple indicators suggest a coordinated attack on critical infrastructure. Financial markets, power grids, communication networks. The timing suggests foreign state involvement, but the sophistication exceeds anything we've seen before." Blake was already accessing secure databases, pulling up intelligence reports and threat assessments. "What's the timeline?" 72 hours, maybe less. Conventional agencies are aware something is happening, but they don't have the resources or authority to respond effectively. We need to move fast. What do you need? Full operational support, technical teams, infiltration specialists, and authorization to operate across multiple jurisdictions without oversight. Blake understood the implications. The kind of operation Evelyn was describing would require resources and authorities that were beyond anything available to conventional agencies. It would mean operating outside normal legal constraints, with the understanding that success would never be officially acknowledged, and failure would be completely disavowed. "I'll make the calls," Blake said. "How soon can you be in position?" "I'm already here," Evelyn replied. "The mission started 6 months ago. Everything we've done since Coronado has been preparation for this moment." The revelation sent a chill through Blake's consciousness. The entire sequence of events, from the original exposure at Coronado to her own recruitment and training, had been building toward whatever was about to unfold. The organization had been positioning its assets and preparing its capabilities for a threat that had been anticipated years in advance. "What's the target?" Blake asked. Desist. The question isn't what, Evelyn replied. It's who. And the answer is going to change everything we thought we knew about global power structures. The call ended, leaving Blake staring at her secure communications equipment and wondering what she had gotten herself involved in. The organization she worked for operated with resources and capabilities that exceeded those of most governments, pursuing objectives that were never subject to public scrutiny or democratic oversight. But as she began making the encrypted calls that would mobilize resources across multiple continents, Blake understood that some threats were too serious to be addressed through conventional means. The world had become too complex and dangerous for traditional institutions to handle alone. Somewhere in the darkness, Evelyn Ward was preparing for a mission that would test every skill she had acquired and every capability the organization had developed. The outcome would determine whether the shadow war that most people never knew existed would remain hidden, or whether it would explode into the open with consequences that nobody could predict. The real story, Blake realized, was just beginning. As encrypted communications flowed across multiple time zones and continents, coordinating resources and positioning assets for whatever was about to unfold, one fact became clear. The incident at Coronado Naval Base had been just the opening move in a game whose true scope and stakes were only now becoming apparent. The woman who had once been known as Evelyn Ward was about to demonstrate why some missions required operators who didn't officially exist, pursuing objectives that couldn't be officially acknowledged, in service of a version of national security that extended far beyond what most Americans could imagine.